The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral stood open like the mouth of something waiting to swallow him whole. Duke Valerius of Vane straightened the gold cufflinks on his charcoal morning coat, drew one slow breath, and walked inside. 300 guests turned their heads. 300 pairs of eyes followed him down the aisle. And every last one of them carried the same quiet thought behind their polite smiles. The Duke of Vane was marrying the ugliest woman in England. He had heard the whispers for weeks. At his club on St. James's Street, gentlemen had leaned across their card tables and spoken in low tones about the reclusive Lady Genevieve of House Oakhaven. Terrible scars, they said. An illness had ravaged her face so completely that her stepmother kept her hidden away in a far wing of the Oakhaven estate, out of mercy. Some said her skin looked like melted candle wax. Others claimed she wore a cloth mask, even among her own servants. Valerius had listened to every word, and he had signed the marriage contract anyway. The reasons were simple enough. His family's fortune had been bleeding for 3 generations. His father had gambled half the estate into debt. His grandfather had mortgaged the other half to fund a shipping venture that sank, quite literally, somewhere off the coast of Portugal. What remained was Highcliffe Manor, grand on the outside, hollow on the inside. The roof leaked in 4 places. The east wing had been closed off for 2 winters because there was no coal to heat it. His tenants were owed repairs he could not afford. Lady Genevieve's dowry would fix everything. Her late father, the Earl of Oakhaven, had left behind one of the largest private fortunes in the north of England. The marriage had been arranged through solicitors and sealed through letters. Valerius had never once met his bride. He reached the altar now and turned to face the congregation. The cathedral smelled of beeswax candles and old stone. Morning light pushed through the stained glass windows and threw patterns of gold and blue across the marble floor. The vicar, a thin man with round spectacles and ink-stained fingers, gave him a nervous nod. Then the organ groaned to life. Every head turned toward the entrance. She appeared at the far end of the aisle, and the cathedral fell into a hush so complete that Valerius could hear the flame of the nearest candle hissing against its wick. Lady Genevieve walked slowly, her gloved hand resting on the arm of a hired escort. She had no father to give her away, no uncle, no brother. She was alone in the world, and this small detail struck Valerius harder than he expected. Her gown was ivory silk, fitted close at the bodice, with pearl buttons trailing down the back. Layers of fine lace gathered at her wrists and along the hem that swept the stone floor behind her. Everything about the dress spoke of old money and careful craftsmanship, but it was the veil that held every gaze in the room. It was unusually heavy. 2 full layers of dense French lace hung from a crown of white roses, falling well past her chin, past her collarbone, all the way to her waist. The fabric was so thick that her face behind it was nothing more than a pale shadow, a ghost walking toward the altar. Valerius felt something tighten inside his chest. He told himself it was just nerves. A man does not marry a stranger every day. She reached him, stood beside him, close enough now that he caught the faint scent of lavender and something else. Old paper, perhaps, like the pages of a book left open near a window. Her breathing was steady, almost practiced, as though she had rehearsed the act of appearing calm. The vicar began the ceremony. His voice echoed upward into the vaulted ceiling, filling the cathedral with familiar words about duty and devotion, and the sacred bond between man and wife. Valerius gave his responses when prompted. His voice was clear. Hers was quiet, barely above a whisper, but firm enough that the vicar accepted each answer with a solemn nod. Then came the moment. "You may now lift the veil," the vicar announced. Valerius turned to face her fully. His fingers reached for the edge of the lace. He could feel the weight of every stair in the room pressing against his back. Somewhere in the front pews, someone shifted forward in their seat. The cathedral seemed to hold its breath. He lifted the veil, and everything he had been told, every rumor, every whispered warning, every pitying glance from his friends, collapsed into dust. The woman standing before him had no scars, no marks, no disfigurement of any kind. Her skin was smooth and clear, touched lightly by a natural warmth across her cheekbones. Her eyes were a deep shade of gray-green, sharp and steady, fixed on his with an expression that was equal parts fear and fierce determination. Her dark hair was pinned beneath the rose crown in careful curls, and a single loose strand fell against her temple. She was, by any measure, one of the most striking women he had ever seen. Valerius stood frozen. His hand still held the edge of the veil. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Behind him, he heard the faint rustle of the congregation, confused murmurs, the creak of wooden pews as people leaned forward for a better look. Then Genevieve spoke. Her voice was low and urgent, meant only for him. Her lips barely moved. "Do not react. My stepmother is seated in the third pew on the left. She is watching us, this very moment. If you hesitate, if you show surprise, she will know that I have spoken to no one about the truth. This ceremony must be completed now, Your Grace. Immediately. For both our sakes." Valerius blinked. His mind turned over her words once, twice. He glanced, just barely, just the slightest shift of his gaze, toward the left side of the nave. There, in the third row, sat a tall woman, dressed in deep plum silk, with a feathered hat, pinned at a sharp angle. Baroness Rebecca. Her face was composed, her posture upright, but her gloved hands were gripping her prayer book so tightly that the leather cover was bending. She had expected this moment to go differently. Valerius looked back at his bride. Genevieve's gray-green eyes had not wavered. She was watching him the way a woman watches a locked door, waiting to see if it will open or stay shut. He made his decision in the space of a single heartbeat. He turned to the vicar. "Continue." The vicar blinked, adjusted his spectacles, and cleared his throat. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The cathedral erupted into applause, though the sound carried an undercurrent of bewildered whispers. Ladies fanned themselves and leaned toward their companions. Gentlemen exchanged sharp looks. Valerius offered his arm to Genevieve. She took it. Her grip was light, but deliberate, and as they turned to walk back down the aisle together, she kept her chin raised and her gaze forward. They passed the third pew on the left. Baroness Rebecca sat perfectly still. Her dark eyes followed them with the kind of focused calm that belongs to a person already planning their next move. Outside, the London air hit Valerius like cold water. The cathedral steps were lined with onlookers and well-wishers, their faces bright with curiosity. A closed carriage waited at the bottom of the steps, its matched pair of bay horses stamping against the cobblestones. As a footman opened the carriage door, Valerius leaned close to his new wife. "You have a great deal of explaining to do, my lady." Genevieve climbed into the carriage without looking back. "I know," she said quietly, "and I promise you, every word of it will be worth hearing." The door shut. The driver cracked his whip, and the carriage pulled away from St. Jude's Cathedral, carrying the Duke of Vane and his unexpected bride into the fading afternoon light, toward answers, toward danger, and toward a truth that had been buried for 8 long years. The carriage rattled north through the outskirts of London as the last gray light drained from the sky. Valerius sat across from Genevieve in silence for the first several miles, listening to the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional shout of the coachman urging the horses onward. Gas lamps flickered past the windows in long streaks of amber, then grew fewer, then disappeared altogether as the city gave way to open country roads. Genevieve had pulled the curtain aside and was staring out at the darkening fields. Her wedding gown pooled around her feet in layers of ivory silk, entirely wrong for travel, but there had been no time to change. Her gloved hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together so tightly that the seams of the leather were straining. Valerius broke the silence first. "We are well clear of London now. Whatever you need to tell me, this would be the time." She turned from the window. In the dim light of the small carriage lantern, her face looked older than it had at the altar. Tired. The kind of tired that sleep alone could never fix. "Where do I begin?" she said, almost to herself. The beginning would do nicely. Genevieve let out a slow breath. "My father married Baroness Rebecca when I was 9 years old. My mother had been dead for 2 years by then, and he was lonely. Rebecca was charming, attentive, and very careful about how she presented herself. Within 6 months of the wedding, she had dismissed every servant who had been loyal to my mother and replaced them with her own people." The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road. Genevieve steadied herself against the seat. "My father fell ill when I was 12. A wasting sickness that took him slowly over the course of a year. During that time, Rebecca assumed control of the household entirely. She managed the accounts, handled all correspondence, and kept visitors away under the excuse that my father was too weak to receive anyone. When he died, I was 13 years old, and I had not been allowed to see him for the final 3 months of his life." Valerius felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And the inheritance? My father's will, the real one, left everything to me upon my marriage. The estate, the land, the accounts in London. Rebecca was to receive a modest annual allowance and the use of the East Cottage for her lifetime. Nothing more." Genevieve's voice hardened at the edges. She found this arrangement unacceptable, so she hid the will. She did far worse than hide it. She produced a second will, one that no solicitor from my father's lifetime had ever seen, which named her as sole guardian of the estate until I reached the age of 30, or married with her written consent. Since she would never grant that consent, the fortune remained under her control indefinitely. The carriage slowed as they approached a crossroads. The coachman called down that they were nearing the coaching inn, where they would stop for fresh horses and a few hours of rest before continuing north. Valerius acknowledged him and turned back to Genevieve. "The rumors about your face," he said carefully. "The scars, the illness." Genevieve's expression shifted into something Valerius could only describe as exhaustion mixed with old anger. "Rebecca started those stories when I was 15. She told the county physician that I had contracted a severe case of smallpox and that my face had been left permanently disfigured. She wrote letters to every family of standing within 50 miles, expressing her deep sorrow over my condition and requesting that no one attempt to visit, as I was too distressed to be seen. And no one questioned this. Why would they? I had already been out of public sight for 2 years. Rebecca kept me in the north wing of Oakhaven, which has its own entrance and its own small garden enclosed by high walls. The servants who attended me were loyal to her and had been instructed to confirm the story if anyone ever inquired. For 8 years, Your Grace, I lived in 4 rooms. I walked in one garden, I read every book in my father's library twice over, and I spoke to almost no one. The carriage pulled into the courtyard of the coaching inn, a squat stone building with a thatched roof and a wooden sign swinging above the door that read, "The Plow and Harrow." Lantern lights spilled from the ground floor windows, and a stable boy came running to tend the horses. They were shown to a private sitting room on the first floor, small but warm, with a fire already burning in the grate. A serving woman brought cold meat, bread, cheese, and a pot of strong tea. Genevieve ate slowly, as though she had forgotten what it felt like to sit at a table that was not inside those 4 rooms. Valerius poured the tea and set a cup before her. How did this marriage come about then? If Rebecca would never consent to a match, how did the contract reach my solicitors? Genevieve wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Rebecca grew greedy. The estate's income was large, but she spent lavishly. Gowns, jewels, a house in Bath, gambling debts she thought no one knew about. By last autumn, she needed fresh capital. A marriage to a duke would bring a generous settlement, paid directly to the bride's household upon signing. She expected you to accept the match because of the dowry. She expected you to overlook my supposed disfigurement because of your family's financial difficulties. And she expected me to keep you hidden away, just as she had done. Precisely. A scarred wife tucked away in some country manor, while the Duke enjoyed the fortune in London. That was her plan. Valerius leaned back in his chair and studied his wife across the small table. The firelight caught the edge of her jaw and the careful way she held herself, straight-backed, watchful, like someone who had spent years listening for footsteps outside a locked door. Her plan has a rather significant flaw, he said. Several, actually, Genevieve replied, and for the first time since the cathedral, something close to a smile crossed her face. Which is why we need to reach Highcliffe Manor before her next move arrives by morning post. They reached Highcliffe Manor on the afternoon of the third day, after 2 changes of horses and 1 sleepless night spent rattling through the rain-soaked roads of the Midlands. The Yorkshire coast announced itself long before the house came into view, a salt wind that cut through the carriage walls and carried the distant crash of waves against chalk cliffs. Genevieve pressed her face to the window as the carriage turned off the main road and onto a long gravel drive lined with old elm trees. The manor appeared gradually through the mist, and she drew a quiet breath at the sight of it. Highcliffe was enormous. 3 stories of gray limestone stretched across the cliff top, its windows dark and tall, its chimneys rising against the white sky like the masts of a ship. Ivy had claimed the eastern wall entirely, and the front steps were worn smooth by 2 centuries of footsteps. The gardens on either side of the approach had gone somewhat wild. Hedgerows that needed trimming, flower beds overtaken by long grass. But the bones of the place were magnificent. "It looks like it grew out of the cliff itself," Genevieve said softly. "It very nearly did. My great-grandfather built it from the same stone he quarried from the hillside behind us." Valerius paused, then added with a dry honesty that surprised even himself, "I should warn you that the inside is less impressive than the outside. We have been managing with a reduced staff for some time." The carriage came to a halt before the front steps. A butler named Haddow, gray-haired and perfectly upright despite his 60-odd years, descended to greet them. Behind him stood a housekeeper, Mrs. Firth, whose round face carried the kind of permanent worry that comes from running a large house on a small budget. 2 footmen and a kitchen maid completed the welcoming party. Haddow opened the carriage door and offered his hand to Genevieve. "Welcome to Highcliffe Manor, Your Grace." Genevieve hesitated for just a moment at the title, Your Grace. She had been Lady Genevieve for so long, and for 8 years she had been nothing at all. She took Haddow's hand and stepped down onto the gravel. Mrs. Firth led her through the entrance hall, a cavernous space with a checkered marble floor and a grand staircase that swept upward in a wide curve. Portraits of vain ancestors lined the walls, men and women in the fashions of generations past, their painted eyes following the new Duchess as she passed beneath them. The air smelled of furniture polish and faintly of damp, and Genevieve noticed that several of the candle sconces along the corridor held no candles at all. She was shown to a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor, a bedchamber, a dressing room, and a small private sitting room, with windows that looked out directly over the sea. The furniture was old but well made, oak and walnut pieces that had been cared for with obvious devotion. A fire had been laid in the grate, and Mrs. Firth had placed a vase of wildflowers on the writing desk, a small touch of warmth that made Genevieve's throat tighten unexpectedly. She stood at the window for a long time after Mrs. Firth left. The sea stretched to the horizon, gray and endless, and the wind pressed against the glass in steady gusts. She could see the edge of the cliff from here, where the grass ended and the chalk dropped away into nothing. Gulls wheeled and cried overhead. For 8 years, her world had been 4 rooms and a walled garden. Now she was looking at the edge of England itself. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and let herself feel the strangeness of it. The open space, the unfamiliar sounds, the absence of locked doors. Her chest ached with something she could not quite name. It sat somewhere between relief and fear, and she suspected it would be a long time before she learned to tell the two apart. Downstairs, Valerius had changed out of his traveling clothes and was sitting in his study when Haddo brought the afternoon post on a silver tray. Most of it was the usual business: tenant reports, a bill from the farrier, a letter from his younger sister in Bath asking for money he did not have. But at the bottom of the stack lay a heavy cream envelope sealed with red wax, addressed in a sharp, precise hand he did not recognize. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was from his solicitor in London, Mr. Alistair Pembroke, and the tone was urgent enough that Valerius read it twice before setting it down. Baroness Rebecca had acted faster than either of them had expected. Within hours of the wedding ceremony, she had filed an emergency injunction with the London courts, claiming that the marriage contract between the Duke of Vane and Lady Genevieve of House Oakhaven was fraudulent. Her grounds were specific. She alleged that the original contract was missing the authenticated family seal of House Oakhaven, which by law was required on all binding marital agreements involving inherited estates. Without that seal, she argued, the marriage had no legal standing, and the dowry transfer could be frozen indefinitely. Pembroke's letter closed with a warning. If the injunction was granted, Baroness Rebecca could petition for Genevieve to be returned to her guardianship, pending a formal review. The hearing was set for 3 weeks from the date of the letter. Valerius folded the page carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer. He sat for a moment, watching the fire settle in the grate, listening to the wind rattle the study windows. Then he stood, crossed the entrance hall, climbed the staircase, and knocked on his wife's sitting-room door. When Genevieve opened it, she took one look at his face and said, "She has already made her move, hasn't she?" Valerius held up the letter. "We have 3 weeks." Genevieve read the contents standing by the window, her back straight, her expression still. When she finished, she folded the letter along its original creases and handed it back to him. "Then we had better not waste a single day." 2 days passed in a quiet rhythm at Highcliffe Manor. Genevieve spent the mornings walking the grounds with Mrs. Firth, learning the layout of the house and the names of the staff. She moved through the rooms carefully, like someone relearning how to breathe after years of holding her breath. Each new corridor, each unlocked door, each view from a different window seemed to require a moment of adjustment, as though her mind needed time to accept that these spaces were truly open to her. Valerius, meanwhile, wrote 3 separate letters to his solicitor in London, requesting every available record of the Oakhaven marriage contract and any legal precedent that might counter the Baroness's injunction. He also sent a private inquiry to the clerk of the London court, asking for the exact terms of the emergency filing. The replies would take days to arrive. Time was a luxury they could not afford to waste. On the 5th morning, Valerius turned his attention to a more immediate matter: Genevieve's personal trunks. There were 4 of them, battered leather cases that had been loaded onto the carriage in London by servants acting on Baroness Rebecca's instructions. Genevieve had barely touched them since arriving at Highcliffe. When Valerius asked why, She gave a simple answer. Rebecca packed them. I do not trust anything that passed through her hands. They carried the trunks into the manor library, a long room on the ground floor, with tall windows facing the sea, and floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with books that 3 generations of Vane dukes had collected. A large oak table occupied the center of the room, and it was here that Valerius set the first trunk down and unfastened its brass clasps. The contents were ordinary enough. Clothes, plain cotton day dresses, a few shawls, stockings, undergarments. Everything was practical and worn, the wardrobe of a woman who had not been permitted to dress for society in nearly a decade. Genevieve sorted through them with an expression that sat somewhere between indifference and old sadness. The second trunk held books. Volumes of poetry, a French dictionary, a well-thumbed copy of Robinson Crusoe, and several collections of botanical illustrations. These Genevieve handled with more care, running her fingers along the cracked spines as though greeting old companions. The third trunk was half empty. A sewing kit, a bundle of dried lavender tied with string, a pair of calfskin gloves with a hole in the left thumb, and a small watercolor set with most of the paints used down to bare tin. It was the fourth trunk that changed everything. This one was heavier than the others, though smaller in size. The leather was darker, older, and the clasps were stiff with disuse. Valerius had to use a letter opener to pry them free. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket, lay a wooden writing case, the kind a gentleman might use for correspondence while traveling. It was made of polished mahogany with brass corners, and the lid bore the engraved initials R.H.O. Genevieve saw the initials and went still. Those are my father's, Richard Henry Oakhaven. Valerius lifted the writing case onto the table and opened it. Inside were dozens of letters. They were bundled together with a thin ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to a pale gray. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly browned, and each envelope was sealed but bore no address. Unsent, every last one of them. Genevieve reached for the nearest bundle with trembling hands. She broke the seal on the first letter and read it in silence, then the second. By the third, her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "These are from my father," she said, her voice barely holding steady. "He wrote them during his final illness. They are addressed to me." Valerius pulled a chair out for her. She sat without seeming to notice and continued reading, one letter after another, spreading them across the oak table like pieces of a map that had been torn apart and scattered. The letters told a story that filled in every gap Genevieve had carried for years. Her father had known, even as the sickness consumed him, that Rebecca could not be trusted. He had written to Genevieve in secret, pouring out instructions, warnings, and declarations of love that were meant to reach her after his death. He described the true will in detail, the one that left the entire Oakhaven fortune to Genevieve upon her marriage. He named the solicitor who had drafted it. He described where the original documents were stored, and in letter after letter he repeated the same plea. Find the family ledger, the one with the authenticated seal, and guard it with your life. Rebecca had intercepted every single letter. She had placed them in this writing case, locked it inside a trunk, and kept them buried among Genevieve's belongings, close enough to be overlooked, far enough from Genevieve's daily reach to remain undiscovered for years. She packed these trunks herself, Genevieve whispered. She must have forgotten the case was still inside, or she assumed I would never think to look. Valerius picked up one of the letters and read the final paragraph aloud. The Earl's handwriting was shaky, but deliberate, each word pressed hard into the paper, as though he knew he was running out of time. The passage described the family ledger, a thick volume bound in green leather, stamped with the Oakhaven seal on its cover, and containing signed records of every major legal transaction the family had undertaken for 40 years. Without that ledger, any document bearing the Oakhaven seal could be challenged. With it, the marriage contract would be unassailable. He says the ledger was kept in the manor library at Oakhaven, Valerius said, setting the letter down. Behind a tapestry on the north wall. Genevieve looked up from the scattered pages. Her expression had changed. The grief was still there, but something stronger had risen beside it. A clarity, a sharpness, the look of a woman who finally held a weapon after years of fighting with empty hands. "Then we know where we need to go," she said. "Oakhaven is 3 days' ride from here. And Rebecca will have the estate well guarded. She will guard the doors and the windows and the main corridors. She always did." Genevieve folded her father's last letter carefully and held it against her chest. But she never knew about the passage behind the library fireplace. "I found it when I was 7 years old, chasing a cat through the servants' hall." Valerius studied her face, the quiet determination, the years of patience now sharpening into purpose. "We will need to move carefully." "We will. But first, we need to reach the county court and register these letters before the legal deadline. If Rebecca's injunction is heard before we enter this evidence, we lose our only advantage." Valerius gathered the letters into a neat stack and placed them back inside the mahogany writing case. He closed the lid and set his hand flat on top of it. "Then we leave at first light." They departed Highcliffe Manor before dawn on the 8th day, while the stars were still fading above the Yorkshire moors. Valerius drove the first hour himself, handling the reins of a light 2-horse carriage, while his coachman, a broad-shouldered man named Thorne, rode alongside on horseback. Genevieve sat inside with the mahogany writing case on her lap, wrapped in a traveling cloak of dark green wool that Mrs. Firth had pressed into her hands at the door. The county court at York opened its registry office only 3 days each week, and the next session was tomorrow. If they missed it, the following opening would fall after the date of Baroness Rebecca's injunction hearing in London. Every hour mattered. The morning passed without trouble. The road south from the coast wound through rolling farmland, past dry stone walls and scattered villages, where smoke curled from cottage chimneys into the pale sky. They stopped once to water the horses at a stone trough outside a blacksmith's forge, and Valerius bought bread and apples from a farmwife who stared openly at the crest on the carriage door. By midday, the landscape began to flatten, and the road dipped toward the river valley. The river Ouse lay directly across their path, a wide, slow-moving stretch of brown water that served as the main artery between the northern estates and the city of York. The primary crossing was a wooden bridge at a place called Thornfield Ford, wide enough for a cart and reinforced with oak beams driven deep into the riverbed. Valerius saw the problem before they reached the bridge itself. A small crowd had gathered on the near bank. 2 farm carts, a wool merchant's wagon, and a handful of travelers on foot, all standing idle with their arms crossed or their hats in their hands. Thorne rode ahead to inquire and returned at a trot, his expression grim. "Bridge is out, Your Grace. The support beams on the far side have given way. The planking is hanging into the water on one end. No one has crossed since yesterday evening." Valerius climbed down from the carriage and walked to the riverbank. The bridge stretched partway across the Ouse, its first 30 feet still intact, but beyond the midpoint the damage was obvious. 3 of the main support beams had cracked and buckled, dropping the right side of the bridge at a steep angle into the current. The broken timbers jutted from the water like snapped bones. He crouched at the edge and examined the nearest damaged beam where it met the bank. The wood was fresh at the break, pale and splintered, with none of the gray weathering that would mark natural decay. He ran his thumb along the edge and found something that made his jaw tighten. Cut marks. Clean, deliberate grooves made by a saw blade, positioned at the base of each beam where the cuts would be hidden beneath the waterline until the weight of the next heavy load finished the job. Thorn had seen it too. He stood beside Valerius and kept his voice low. "That is no accident, Your Grace." "No, it is not." Valerius straightened and looked across the river. The far bank was perhaps 60 yards away, lined with willow trees whose branches trailed in the current. The road to York continued on the other side, clearly visible as it climbed a gentle rise toward the south. Genevieve had stepped out of the carriage. She walked to the bank and took in the scene without a word, her eyes moving from the broken bridge to the stranded travelers, to the cut marks on the timber. When she looked at Valerius, her face held no surprise, only a weary recognition. "Rebecca has people in this county," she said quietly. "She always has. Can we ride further upstream to the next bridge?" Valerius asked Thorn. The coachman shook his head. "The next crossing is at Millthorpe, 14 miles east. Even at a hard pace, we would lose the rest of today and arrive in York too late for tomorrow's registry session." Valerius turned back to the river. The Ouse was wide here, but the current was not fast. Autumn had been dry, and the water level sat lower than usual. He could see ripples breaking over a shallow stretch, roughly 40 yards upstream, where the riverbed rose and gravel bars poked above the surface. "Thorn, walk upstream and test that shallow stretch. Take a stick and measure the depth at the deepest point. If the water stays below 3 feet, we can ford it." Thorn dismounted and did as instructed, wading carefully into the river with a long branch held before him like a staff. The water reached his shins at the edges and climbed to just above his knees at the center. He prodded the bottom, testing for soft mud or hidden drops, and made his way across in a slow diagonal line. When he reached the far bank, he turned and raised his arm. "Firm bottom, Your Grace. Gravel all the way. Deepest point came to my thigh, and I am not a short man." Valerius returned to the carriage and explained the plan to Genevieve. She listened, glanced at the ford, and reached for the writing case. "I will carry this myself. If the carriage tips, these letters cannot touch the water." He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes told him it would be a waste of breath. He nodded. They unhitched the horses and led them upstream to the ford. Thorn took the first horse across on foot, while Valerius guided the second. The carriage would follow last, pulled at an angle across the current, with ropes secured to both animals. Genevieve walked between the two men, the writing case pressed against her chest, beneath her cloak, her boots sinking into the gravel with each step. The river soaked her skirts to the waist. The cold drew a sharp breath from her lungs. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a smooth stone, and she stumbled forward. Valerius caught her arm and steadied her without a word, and she found her footing again and kept walking. They reached the far bank wet, cold and intact. Thorn brought the carriage across with a careful hand, the wheels grinding over the gravel bottom while the current pushed against the undercarriage. It listed once, badly, and Genevieve's grip tightened on the writing case. But Thorn corrected the angle, and the carriage rolled up onto solid ground. Valerius helped Genevieve back into the carriage and draped a dry horse blanket around her shoulders. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp strands against her neck. She was shivering, but she set the writing case on the seat beside her and met his eyes with a look that carried something new. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had said those words to him without any formality behind them. Just 2 words, plain and honest. Valerius closed the carriage door. "Save your thanks for York. We still have 15 miles to cover before dark." Thorn cracked the reins, and the carriage lurched forward onto the southern road, leaving the broken bridge and the brown river behind them. They registered the letters at the York County Court on the 9th day, arriving with barely an hour to spare before the registry office closed its doors. The clerk, a meticulous young man with ink-stained cuffs, examined each letter individually, recorded the dates and contents in the court ledger, and applied the official stamp of receipt. The documents were now part of the legal record. Rebecca could no longer deny their existence, but the letters alone were not enough. Mr. Pembroke's latest dispatch from London had made that painfully clear. The Baroness's legal counsel was arguing that the marriage contract lacked the authenticated Oakhaven family seal, and without the original ledger to verify that seal, the court could still rule in Rebecca's favor. The letters proved the Earl's intentions. The ledger would prove the contract's legitimacy. They needed both. Valerius and Genevieve spent 2 nights in York, resting at a modest inn near the Minster, while Thorne saw to the horses and the carriage. On the evening of the 10th day, they sat together in the inn's private dining room and planned their approach to Oakhaven. Genevieve drew a rough map of the estate on the back of a menu card, using the stub of a pencil borrowed from the innkeeper's wife. Her hand moved with the certainty of someone who had walked those corridors 1,000 times in her memory. "The main house has 3 entrances," she said, marking each one with a small cross. "The front door faces south, toward the drive. The servants' entrance is on the east side, near the kitchens, and there is a garden door on the west wall that leads into the conservatory, all of which Rebecca will have watched," Valerius said. "Yes, she keeps a groundskeeper named Sykes, who has been with her since before my father died. He patrols the grounds each night with a lantern and a dog. The servants retire by 10 o'clock, and Sykes makes his rounds on the hour until dawn. Then we go between his rounds." Genevieve tapped the pencil against a spot on the northern edge of her map. "There is a stone wall here, at the back of the kitchen garden. It borders a small wood that runs along the rear of the property. When I was a girl, I discovered a place where the wall had cracked near the base, wide enough for a child to enter. I used to slip out to pick blackberries in the wood when the cook was not looking. You are no longer a child. The crack was wide enough for the garden boy as well, and he was 15, and tall for his age. It will serve." She drew a dotted line from the wall to the house. From the gap in the wall, it is 40 yards across the kitchen garden to the servants' corridor. The corridor connects to the main hallway, and the library is the 3rd door on the left. "And the passage behind the fireplace?" Genevieve closed her eyes, as though walking the route inside her head. "The library fireplace has a stone mantelpiece carved with oak leaves, the family crest. On the left side, the 3rd leaf from the bottom is loose. Push it inward, and the panel beside the hearth swings open. The passage beyond runs between the walls and opens into a small archive room that my grandfather built to store the family's private records. That is where the ledger will be." They departed York before first light on the 11th day and rode west toward the Oakhaven estate. The countryside grew familiar to Genevieve as they traveled. She recognized the shape of certain hills, the bend of a stream, the spire of a parish church rising above a line of beech trees. She said very little during the journey, but Valerius noticed the way her hands gripped the edge of the seat each time a new landmark appeared through the window. She was returning to the place that had been both her home and her prison, and every mile closer carried its own particular weight. They left the carriage and Thorne at a farmstead 2 miles from the estate, paying the farmer's wife handsomely for the use of her barn and her silence. The rest of the distance they covered on foot, walking through damp fields under a sky just beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. The fog was their ally. It rolled in from the low ground like a gray tide, thick enough to muffle sound and obscure the shape of 2 figures moving along the tree line. They reached the stone wall at the back of the kitchen garden, just as the first pale glow of morning touched the tops of the trees. Genevieve found the crack in the wall without hesitation. Time and weather had widened it since her childhood, and she passed through with room to spare. Valerius followed, catching his coat on the rough stone and leaving a torn patch of wool behind. The kitchen garden was overgrown. Rows of vegetables had gone to seed, and weeds choked the gravel paths between the beds. Rebecca's attention to the estate had clearly declined, along with her finances. They crossed the garden in silence, keeping low, and reached the servants' corridor through a door whose latch Genevieve lifted with practiced ease. Inside, the house was dark and still. The corridor smelled of cold grease and yesterday's coal smoke. Their footsteps were careful and slow on the flagstone floor. Genevieve led the way with one hand trailing along the wall, counting doors by touch, until she reached the main hallway. The library door was unlocked. They slipped inside, and Genevieve crossed directly to the fireplace. Her fingers found the carved oak leaves on the mantelpiece and counted downward. Third from the bottom, left side. She pressed it inward. Something clicked deep inside the stone, and the panel beside the hearth shifted with a low grinding sound that made both of them freeze. They waited. The house remained silent. Genevieve pulled the panel open and stepped into the passage beyond. Valerius followed, ducking beneath a low beam. The air inside was cold and stale, untouched for years. Cobwebs clung to the rough walls, and the floor was thick with dust that recorded every footstep. The passage turned once, then opened into a small, windowless room lined with wooden shelves. Ledgers, deed boxes, and bundles of yellowed paper filled every surface. Genevieve moved along the shelves, reading the spines of the ledgers by the thin light of the candle Valerius had taken from the library mantelpiece. She stopped. Her hand closed around a thick volume bound in green leather, its cover stamped with the Oakhaven crest, an oak tree with spreading branches above a family motto in Latin. She opened it. The pages were intact. The seal was pressed into the inside cover in dark red wax, clear and unmistakable. Genevieve held the ledger against her chest, the same way she had held her father's letters at the river crossing. When she looked at Valerius, her eyes were bright, and her voice carried the steady calm of someone who has finally found the thing they have been searching for across a very long darkness. We have it. Every piece. She cannot touch us now. They left the way they came, pulling the panel shut behind them, crossing the library, slipping through the servants' corridor, and out into the fog-covered garden. By the time the first kitchen maid stirred in her bed on the floor above, they were already past the wall and walking fast through the gray morning toward the farmstead where Thorne was waiting with the carriage. The journey back to York took the better part of 2 days. They traveled cautiously, avoiding the main roads where possible and stopping only at inns where Thorne was known from years of driving the Vane carriage along the northern routes. Genevieve kept the green ledger and the mahogany writing case together in a leather satchel that never left her side. She carried it into every inn, every dining room, and slept with it tucked beneath her pillow. On the morning of the 14th day, they entered the city of York through the Micklegate Bar, the ancient stone gateway whose arch had watched centuries of travelers pass beneath it. The streets were already busy, with market carts, cattle drovers, and tradesmen setting up their stalls along the cobbled lanes. The air smelled of fresh bread, horse dung, and the faint sweetness of apples from the fruit sellers near the shambles. The county court occupied a handsome brick building on a wide street near the minster. Its front steps were flanked by iron railings, and a pair of heavy wooden doors stood open beneath a carved stone lintel bearing the royal coat of arms. Clerks and solicitors moved in and out with bundles of papers under their arms, their black coats flapping in the autumn wind. Valerius helped Genevieve down from the carriage and straightened his own coat. He had dressed carefully that morning. A dark blue frock coat, a waistcoat of gray silk, a freshly starched cravat tied in a precise knot. He looked every inch the Duke of Vane, and he intended the court to see exactly that. Genevieve wore a dress of deep green wool that Mrs. Firth had altered from one of the late Duchess's gowns found in the Highcliffe attics. It was simple and well cut, with a high collar and fitted sleeves. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet. She carried no fan, no parasol, no jewelry of any kind. She wanted the court to see her face clearly, without distraction, without ornament, and without a veil. They climbed the steps together and were directed by a court usher to the chambers of the High Magistrate, Sir Edmund Hale. The hearing room was a wood-paneled space with tall windows that let in long shafts of morning light. Rows of benches faced a raised platform where the magistrate's desk sat beneath a portrait of the king. A clerk's table occupied one side, stacked with documents and inkwells. The room smelled of old wood and candle wax, and every footstep echoed on the stone floor. Several people were already seated. A pair of local solicitors waited on the front bench, reviewing their notes. A court reporter sat at a small desk near the window, his pen ready. And in the second row, on the left side of the room, sat Baroness Rebecca. She had brought counsel. A tall, angular man in a black coat, whose name, Valerius would later learn, was Mr. Cedric Hatch, a London solicitor known for his sharp tongue and his willingness to represent clients whose cases required more aggression than evidence. He sat beside the Baroness with a thick folder of papers open on his knee, speaking to her in a low murmur. Rebecca herself was dressed in plum-colored silk, the same shade she had worn at the wedding. Her posture was perfect, her chin slightly raised, her expression carrying the polished calm of a woman who believed she had already won. She did not look at Valerius and Genevieve as they entered. She did not need to. In her mind, this hearing was a formality, a brief legal exercise that would end with the marriage contract declared void and her stepdaughter returned to her keeping. Sir Edmund Hale entered the chamber through a side door and took his seat behind the raised desk. He was a stout man in his late 50s, with a weathered face and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades separating truth from performance. He wore the magistrate's robes with the ease of long habit and opened the proceedings without ceremony. The matter before this court concerns an emergency injunction filed by Baroness Rebecca Oakhaven against the marriage contract between Duke Valerius of Vane and Lady Genevieve of House Oakhaven. The Baroness claims the contract lacks the authenticated family seal and is therefore void under statute. Mr. Hatch, you may present your case. Hatch rose and spoke for 10 minutes with the smooth confidence of a man reading from a well-rehearsed script. He argued that the marriage contract had been executed without proper authority, that the Oakhaven family seal was absent from the document, and that Baroness Rebecca, as the legally recognized guardian of Lady Genevieve, had never granted formal consent. He described Genevieve as a vulnerable young woman of fragile health and diminished capacity, manipulated into a hasty union by a duke seeking access to her fortune. He never once mentioned the supposed disfigurement. That particular lie, it seemed, was no longer useful. When Hatch finished, Sir Edmund turned to Valerius. "Your Grace, do you wish to respond?" Valerius stood. "I do, Sir Edmund, and I would ask that my wife be permitted to address the court directly." A murmur passed through the room. Rebecca's composure flickered, a brief tightening around her mouth, quickly corrected. Hatch glanced sideways at her, his pen pausing above his notes. Sir Edmund studied Genevieve for a moment, then nodded. "The Duchess may speak." Genevieve rose from the bench and walked forward until she stood before the magistrate's desk. She carried the leather satchel in both hands. The room was utterly silent. "Sir Edmund, my name is Genevieve Oakhaven, now Duchess of Vane. I stand before this court of my own free will, in full possession of my faculties, and with evidence that will answer every claim my stepmother has raised." She opened the satchel and placed the mahogany writing case on the clerk's table. "These are letters written by my father, the late Earl of Oakhaven, during his final illness. They were addressed to me and intercepted by Baroness Rebecca before they could be delivered. They describe his true will, his wishes for my inheritance, and his explicit instructions regarding the family seal. She then placed the green leather ledger beside the writing case. And this is the original Oakhaven family ledger, containing the authenticated seal, retrieved from the private archive at Oakhaven Manor, where my father stored it for safekeeping. She opened the ledger to the inside cover. The red wax seal was clearly visible. The oak tree, the spreading branches, the Latin motto pressed deep into the wax. Sir Edmund leaned forward to examine it, then gestured for his clerk to inspect the letters. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Hatch had stopped writing. His folder of papers sat open and useless on his knee. Baroness Rebecca stared at the green ledger, as though it were a door she had believed to be permanently locked, now standing wide open before her. The color had drained from her face, and for the first time since the wedding at St. Jude's, she had no prepared expression to hide behind. Sir Edmund examined the evidence for several long minutes. He read 2 of the letters in full, compared the seal in the ledger against the one on the marriage contract, and consulted briefly with his clerk. Then he raised his head. The seal is authentic. The letters corroborate the terms of the original will. The injunction filed by Baroness Rebecca is dismissed. The marriage contract between Duke Valerius of Vane and Lady Genevieve of House Oakhaven stands in full legal force. He turned his gaze toward Rebecca. Baroness, this court will be forwarding the contents of the Earl's letters to the appropriate authorities for further review of your conduct during your guardianship. You are advised to secure legal counsel for yourself. This hearing is concluded. The magistrate's gavel struck once, and the sound rang through the chamber like the closing of a very old, very heavy door. They returned to Oakhaven on the 21st day, traveling west from York under a sky washed clean by overnight rain. The autumn countryside was turning gold and copper, and the hedgerows along the lanes were heavy with blackberries and rosehips. Genevieve watched the familiar landmarks past the carriage window, with an expression Valerius had not seen on her face before, something open and unguarded, like a held breath finally released. The estate looked different in daylight. When they had last been here, creeping through fog and shadow, the house had been a place to enter and leave as quickly as possible. Now, as the carriage rolled up the long gravel drive and the manor appeared through the avenue of chestnut trees, Genevieve saw it as it truly was, her home, reclaimed. Oakhaven Manor was a Jacobean house of warm red brick with mullioned windows and tall chimneys grouped in decorative clusters. The gardens had once been the pride of the county, designed by Genevieve's grandmother and maintained by a staff of 6 groundsmen. Now the box hedges had lost their shape, the rose beds were choked with thistle, and the ornamental pond near the south terrace had silted over and gone green with algae. The household staff were gathered at the front entrance when the carriage stopped. There were fewer of them than Genevieve remembered. A cook, 2 housemaids, a scullery girl, an elderly gardener, and a footman who looked barely old enough to shave. They stood in an uneven line, uncertain and visibly nervous. These were the people Rebecca had kept on at reduced wages after dismissing the larger staff over the years to cut expenses and pocket the savings. Genevieve stepped down from the carriage and looked at each of them in turn. Several of the older servants recognized her immediately. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Bartlett, who had been at Oakhaven since Genevieve's mother was alive, pressed her hand to her mouth and blinked rapidly. "Mrs. Bartlett," Genevieve said, and her voice was warm and steady. "I hope the kitchen is still where I left it." Mrs. Bartlett let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "It is, my lady, your grace, I should say. It is exactly where you left it, and the kettle is already on." That small exchange broke the tension like a stone through glass. The housemaids curtsied, The footman stammered a welcome, and the old gardener removed his cap and held it against his chest with both hands. Genevieve greeted each of them by name, where she could, and asked gentle questions of those she did not recognize. Within 10 minutes, the stiff formality had melted into something resembling relief. The interior of the house told its own story. Rebecca had maintained the public rooms, the drawing room, the dining room, the main staircase, in reasonable condition, since these were the spaces she used when entertaining her own guests. But beyond those rooms, the decay was evident. Wallpaper peeled in the upstairs corridors. Several windows had cracked panes stuffed with rags to keep out drafts. The servants' quarters were cold and bare, stripped of all but the most basic furnishings. And the north wing, where Genevieve had been confined for 8 years, had been locked entirely since her departure. She asked for the key. The footman produced it from a hook in the butler's pantry, and Genevieve walked the corridor alone. Valerius waited at the end of the hallway, giving her the space she needed. He heard her footsteps slow as she reached the rooms, the creak of a door opening, a long silence, then another door, another silence. When she returned, her eyes were dry, but her jaw was set in a way that told him what those rooms had cost her. "I want the north wing cleared," she said quietly. "New paint, new curtains, proper furniture. It will be guest quarters from now on. I will not have those rooms sit empty and remember what they were." Valerius spent the following days working alongside Genevieve to bring the estate back to order. He had experience managing Highcliffe on limited resources, and that knowledge proved useful here, where the problems were different in scale but similar in nature. Together, they reviewed the household accounts, which Rebecca had kept in a state of deliberate confusion, columns that did not add up, expenses recorded under false categories, and entire quarters where no records existed at all. They hired a local land agent named Mr. Dowell, a sensible man with sandy whiskers and a talent for plain speaking, who rode out to inspect the tenant farms and returned with a list of urgent repairs. Fences were down. 2 cottages had leaking roofs. The drainage ditches along the eastern fields had not been cleared in 3 seasons, and the autumn planting was already behind schedule. Genevieve handled the domestic side with a competence that surprised everyone except Valerius. She met with Mrs. Bartlett each morning to plan meals and supplies. She interviewed candidates for new household positions and selected them with a careful eye for character over references. She wrote to a seamstress in York to commission proper uniforms for the staff and arranged for a glazier to replace every cracked window in the house before the first frost. In the evenings, after the work was done and the household had settled, Valerius and Genevieve found themselves sitting together in the Oakhaven Library, the same room where the secret passage lay hidden behind the fireplace. They talked over cups of tea that Mrs. Bartlett kept appearing to refill. They discussed the estate's future, the legal proceedings still winding through the London courts, and occasionally, carefully, the years that Genevieve had lost. One evening, as the fire burned low and the clock on the mantelpiece struck 10, Genevieve set down her teacup and looked across at Valerius with an expression he had not seen before. It was softer than gratitude and steadier than affection. It sat somewhere between trust and the beginning of something deeper that neither of them had expected to find inside this arrangement. "You could have walked away," she said. "At the altar, when you lifted the veil, you could have refused. You had every reason to believe you had been deceived." Valerius considered this for a moment. "I had every reason to believe that something was very wrong. And a gentleman does not leave a woman standing alone at the altar when something is very wrong. Is that why you stayed? Duty?" He met her gaze across the firelight. It was duty at the altar. It was curiosity in the carriage. It was anger at the coaching inn. "When I heard what had been done to you." He paused. I am not certain what to call what it is now, but it is none of those things." Genevieve held his gaze for a long moment. Then she smiled. A real smile, full and unguarded, the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the shape of a face entirely. It was the first time Valerius had seen her smile like that, and he understood with sudden clarity that he would remember it for the rest of his life. "Whatever it is," she said, "I am glad of it." Outside, the wind moved through the chestnut trees, and the last leaves of autumn drifted down across the darkened gardens of Oakhaven. Inside, the fire crackled and settled, and the two of them sat together in the quiet library, learning the unfamiliar and welcome shape of a life shared by choice rather than contract. The invitation cards went out on the 25th day, printed on thick cream stock with the Vane family crest embossed in gold at the top. Mrs. Firth had personally supervised the order from a printer in York, and she inspected each card with the seriousness of a general reviewing battle plans before they were placed into their envelopes and dispatched by messenger across the county. "The Duke and Duchess of Vane request the pleasure of your company at a grand ball to be held at Highcliffe Manor on the evening of the 30th day of October, 1842. Within 3 days, every invitation had been accepted. The curiosity alone would have filled the ballroom twice over. All of Yorkshire society wanted to see the woman behind the rumors, the supposedly disfigured heiress who had emerged from 8 years of seclusion, defeated her stepmother in open court, and married one of the most prominent dukes in the north. The story had traveled fast, carried along by newspaper reports and drawing-room gossip, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Highcliffe Manor underwent a transformation in the days before the ball. Valerius had allocated a portion of the Oakhaven funds, now legally restored to Genevieve's control, toward the event and toward long-overdue repairs to the house. Workmen replaced the damaged roof slates and rehung the shutters on the east wing. The entrance hall floor was scrubbed and polished until the checkered marble gleamed. The grand ballroom, which had been closed and draped in dust sheets for nearly 4 years, was opened, aired, and filled with light. Mrs. Firth commanded the preparations with a quiet ferocity that left the household staff too busy to eat. The chandeliers were lowered on their chains, cleaned crystal by crystal, and raised again. Hundreds of beeswax candles were fitted into every sconce and candelabra. Garlands of ivy and late-season roses were wound along the banisters of the grand staircase. The kitchen worked through the night, producing trays of cold meats, pastries, syllabubs, and a towering centerpiece of spun sugar that the cook guarded with devotion. On the afternoon of the ball, Genevieve stood in her dressing room on the 2nd floor, while a hired lady's maid from York helped her into her gown. It was the finest thing she had ever worn, a deep emerald silk that caught the candlelight and turned it to liquid along every fold. The bodice was fitted with delicate beadwork, and the sleeves fell just off the shoulders in the current fashion. Her hair was arranged in a low knot at the nape of her neck, threaded with a thin strand of seed pearls that had belonged to Valerius's mother. She studied herself in the long mirror beside the wardrobe. The woman looking back at her was almost a stranger. For 8 years, her reflection had been confined to a small hand mirror in a dim room. She had grown used to seeing herself in fragments. An eye, a cheek, the line of her jaw. Now she saw the whole, and she needed a moment to reconcile the two. There was a knock at the door. Valerius entered, dressed in black evening clothes with a white cravat and a single gold watch chain across his waistcoat. He stopped when he saw her and said nothing for several seconds. Then he offered his arm. "The carriages are arriving." She took his arm. "How many?" Haddo counted 14 on the drive, and more coming up the hill. They descended the grand staircase together. Below them, the entrance hall was already filling with guests. Ladies in silk and satin, gentlemen in tailcoats and polished boots. The rustle of fabric and the hum of conversation rising toward the vaulted ceiling. Heads turned as the Duke and Duchess appeared at the top of the stairs. The murmur of voices dropped, then swelled again with a new energy. Genevieve felt every pair of eyes on her face. She understood what they were looking for. The scars, the marks, some trace of the terrible disfigurement that Baroness Rebecca had described so convincingly for so many years. She let them look. She kept her chin level and her hand steady on Valerius's arm, and she walked down each step with the measured grace of a woman who had earned the right to be seen. The ballroom doors were thrown open at 8 o'clock. The musicians, a string quartet and a pianist brought from York for the occasion, began with a slow waltz, and Valerius led Genevieve onto the floor for the first dance. The room watched in attentive silence as they moved through the opening measures. Genevieve's steps were careful at first. She had learned to dance as a girl, but 8 years without practice had dulled the memory in her feet. Valerius guided her with a light hand and a patience that required no words, adjusting his pace to hers, giving her room to find the rhythm on her own terms. By the second turn around the floor, she had it. Her shoulders eased. Her steps grew confident, and when the music reached its final phrase, she was moving as though the waltz had been waiting for her all along. The applause that followed was generous and warm. Other couples joined the floor for the next dance, and the evening opened into the kind of celebration that Highcliffe Manor had not seen in a generation. There was laughter and wine and music that spilled from the open ballroom windows out into the cool October night, where the stars hung sharp and bright above the Yorkshire coast. Guests approached Genevieve throughout the evening, some out of genuine kindness, others out of curiosity they could not quite disguise. She received them all with the same steady composure. She answered their questions without bitterness, offered her hand without hesitation, and spoke about the future of the Oakhaven and Vane estates with a clarity that left more than one seasoned landowner nodding in quiet approval. Late in the evening, as the musicians played a gentler melody and the candles burned low in their sconces, Valerius found Genevieve standing alone near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom. She was looking out at the sea, which was visible as a dark line beneath the moonlit sky, the waves catching silver light as they rolled toward the base of the cliffs. He stood beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the ball continued behind them. Music, conversation, the clink of glasses. But here by the window, there was a pocket of stillness that belonged only to them. 1 month ago, Genevieve said, I was sitting in a locked room, reading a book I had already read 6 times, listening to the clock mark another hour of another day that was exactly like the one before it. Valerius looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window, the emerald gown, the pearls in her hair, the calm certainty in her expression. And now, he said. She turned from the window and faced him. The candlelight from the ballroom fell across her features, and her gray-green eyes held something that Valerius recognized because he felt it himself. The quiet, steady warmth of a bond that had been forged through shared purpose and tested by every obstacle that could be thrown against it. Now I am standing in my own home, beside a man I chose to trust on the strangest morning of my life. She paused, and the corner of her mouth lifted. I would say that is a considerable improvement. Valerius laughed, a real laugh, rare for him, and it drew a few curious glances from nearby guests. He offered her his hand. Then may I have the last dance, Your Grace? Genevieve placed her hand in his. You may, Your Grace. They walked back onto the ballroom floor together as the musicians began the final waltz of the evening. The candles flickered in the draught from the open windows. The sea murmured far below the cliffs, and the Duke and Duchess of Vane turned slowly through the music. 2 people who had entered a marriage of convenience and found within it something far rarer, a partnership built on courage, sealed by trust, and carried forward into a future that neither of them had dared to imagine, but both of them had earned. The last note faded, the guests applauded, and Highcliffe Manor, old and weathered and full of light for the first time in years, stood steady on the cliff top above the sea, its doors open wide to whatever came next.